The scratching started at 3:17 a.m. Nurse Rebecca Torres had been working the graveyard shift at Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital for 6 months, and she knew every sound the old building made. The pipes that groaned like dying animals, the fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered in Ward C. Even the way the wind made the barred windows rattle like skeletal fingers tapping to get in. But she'd never heard scratching coming from inside the walls. It was coming from room 237, the room that had been sealed with industrial steel plates bolted directly into the concrete frame. The room that didn't officially exist on any floor plan or patient roster. The room that every staff member was specifically instructed to never, under any circumstances, acknowledge or discuss. Rebecca pressed her ear against the cold metal plating. The scratching was rhythmic, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across stone. Then she heard something that made her blood turn to ice. A voice, muffled but unmistakably human, whispering the same phrase over and over. "Let me out. Let me out. Let me out." She jerked away from the wall and checked her watch. 3:17 a.m. The exact time when, according to the hospital records she wasn't supposed to have access to, patient 237 had died in that room 47 years ago. Rebecca read the file. Patient 237 was a 12-year-old girl named Emma Hartwell, committed in 1976 for severe behavioral disturbances and violence toward family members. The treatment methods used at Blackwood in the 1970s were aggressive. Emma had been subjected to experimental drug cocktails, ice baths, and electroshock therapy that would be considered torture by today's standards. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest during routine treatment, but the handwritten notes in the margins told a different story. Notes about Emma clawing at the padded walls until her fingers bled. Notes about her screaming for 17 straight hours before suddenly falling silent. Notes about how they found deep gouges in the concrete walls that looked like they'd been made by human fingernails. The scratching stopped. Rebecca stood frozen in the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence was somehow worse than the sound had been. She grabbed her flashlight and walked the length of the corridor, checking on the 12 patients currently housed in Ward D. All asleep, all accounted for. When she returned to the nurse's station, she found a message written on her patient chart in a child's handwriting. "I've been waiting for someone to hear me." Rebecca's hands shook as she stared at the words. The pen was still sitting exactly where she'd left it. No one had passed by her station. The security cameras would show she'd been alone in the corridor for the past 10 minutes. But the message was there, written in purple ink, in the careful cursive of a child who'd learned to write in the 1970s. Over the next 3 weeks, the encounters escalated. Rebecca would find toys in places where no toys should be. A plastic doll with its face scratched off sitting on her desk. A rusty music box that played children's songs at 3:17 a.m. every night. Patient medications would be mysteriously rearranged, always in groups of 37. Emma's patient number. The other staff members noticed Rebecca's deteriorating condition. She was jumpy, exhausted, talking about sounds and sights that no one else experienced. The day shift nurses whispered that she was having a breakdown, that she needed psychological evaluation herself. But then, 3 weeks after the first incident, Rebecca wasn't the only one who heard it. Dr. Martinez was doing his monthly night rounds when he stopped dead in the middle of Ward D. "Do you hear that scratching?" he asked Rebecca. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Room 237. It happens every night at 3:17. Dr. Martinez walked to the sealed room and pressed his ear against the metal plating. His face went white. "There's someone in there. Someone's trapped inside." "That's impossible," Rebecca said. The room was sealed 47 years ago. The steel plates are welded shut. But Dr. Martinez was already on his radio, calling maintenance, demanding they bring cutting torches. I don't care what the protocols say. If someone is alive in there, we have a legal obligation to help them. It took the maintenance crew 2 hours to cut through the steel plating. Behind the metal barrier, they found a room that had been sealed in 1976 and never opened. The air that rushed out was stale and cold, carrying the smell of old concrete and something else, something organic and wrong. Rebecca followed Dr. Martinez into the room, her flashlight beam dancing across walls that were covered in scratches. Deep gouges in the concrete that formed words, sentences, entire paragraphs scratched into the stone by human fingernails. The writing covered every surface, the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. But it wasn't 47 years old. The writing was fresh. Some of it was still warm to the touch, as if it had been carved moments before they arrived. And all of it, every single word scratched into those concrete walls, was the same message, repeated thousands of times. Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for hearing me. In the center of the room, they found a small hospital gown folded neatly on the floor. When Dr. Martinez lifted it with trembling hands, something fell out. A plastic patient bracelet with the name Emma Hartwell and the number 237. The bracelet was brand new. Rebecca quit that night and never returned to Blackwood. But sometimes, when she's lying in bed at 3:17 a.m., she still hears the scratching. And she knows that somewhere in rooms that shouldn't exist, Emma Hartwell is still carving her gratitude into stone walls, thanking the woman who finally listened. Last week, Rebecca received a letter at her new job. No return address, no postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in a child's handwriting. I'm not alone anymore. Others heard you listening. They want to thank you too. Rebecca burned the letter, but she can't burn the knowledge that she's opened something that should have stayed sealed. Because now, every night at 3:17 a.m., she doesn't just hear Emma scratching in the walls. She hears dozens of voices. All the children who died in places like Blackwood, all the patients whose screams were ignored for decades, all whispering the same message. Thank you for hearing us. Now help us get out.
Don't forget to like and subscribe if you dare to hear more chilling stories. The file landed on Dr. James Coleman's desk at 11:47 p.m. with no explanation. Patient transfer request, priority, urgent. From Riverside State Hospital, closed 1994, to Pine Valley Mental Health Facility. Patient name, redacted. Patient ID, 1349. Special instructions. Extreme caution advised. Do not leave patient unattended. Do not make direct eye contact. Transfer must be completed before dawn. Dr. Coleman had been running Pine Valley for 12 years, and he'd never seen a transfer request like this. For starters, Riverside State Hospital had been demolished 15 years ago. The property was now a shopping mall, complete with an electroshock therapy wing used to be. He called the state's psychiatric authority, but their night operator had no record of any pending transfers. The phone number on the transfer form led to a disconnected line. The email address bounced back as undeliverable. But at midnight, exactly when the form indicated, Dr. Coleman heard the distinctive rumble of a transport van pulling into his facility's loading dock. Against every instinct screaming at him to stay in his office, Dr. Coleman walked to the back entrance. Through the reinforced glass doors, he could see an old ambulance, the kind they stopped making in the 1980s, idling in the parking lot.
The driver was obscured by shadows, but Dr. Coleman could see someone sitting in the passenger seat. Someone small, child-sized. Dr. Coleman opened the door. The driver stepped out, and Coleman's breath caught in his throat. The man was wearing a Pine Valley uniform, the same gray scrubs that Coleman's staff wore, but the fabric looked ancient, faded, and stained with things Coleman didn't want to identify. The name tag read Attendant Morrison in font that Pine Valley had stopped using 20 years ago. "Dr. Coleman?" the attendant asked. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "We have a transfer for you." "I need to see some paperwork," Coleman said, his professional instincts kicking in despite his growing terror. Attendant Morrison handed him a clipboard with forms that looked official, but wrong. The letterhead was correct, but the paper felt strange, almost organic, like skin. The ink seemed to shift and move in the light from the loading dock. "Patient 1349 needs immediate placement," Morrison said. "She's been waiting a long time for a new home." Coleman looked through the forms. Patient history, medical records, psychiatric evaluations, all standard, except for the dates. According to the paperwork, patient 1349 had been admitted to Riverside in 1952 at age 7 for acute behavioral disturbances following family trauma. The treatment notes spanning the next 42 years made for horrific reading. Experimental surgeries, drug trials, isolation therapy that lasted months at a time. And through it all, patient 1349's condition never improved. If anything, the reports suggested she became more dangerous, more unpredictable, more inhuman. The final entry, dated November 15, 1994, the day Riverside closed, simply read, "Patient cannot be released into general population. Permanent containment recommended. Disposal not authorized." "Where has she been for the past 29 years?" Coleman asked. Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Waiting." Coleman should have refused the transfer, should have called the police, the state authorities, anyone. But something about Morrison's presence made it impossible to say no. It was as if the attendant's very existence was overriding Coleman's free will. "Room 13 is prepared," Coleman heard himself saying. "Single occupancy, reinforced door." Morrison nodded and walked back to the ambulance. When he opened the rear doors, Coleman saw her. Patient 1349 looked exactly like a 7-year-old girl would look if she'd spent 71 years in psychiatric facilities. Her hospital gown was clean but archaic, the kind they used in the 1950s. Her hair was white, not gray, but pure white, like fresh snow. And her eyes. Her eyes held the accumulated weight of 70 decades of medical torture, 70 decades of being treated like a laboratory rat, 70 decades of screaming into padded rooms where no one could hear her. But she looked 7 years old. Morrison wheeled her into the facility on a gurney that squeaked with each turn of its ancient wheels. Patient 1349 didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. She just stared at the ceiling with those terrible knowing eyes. "Special dietary requirements?" Coleman asked, falling back on routine questions to maintain his sanity. "She doesn't eat," Morrison said. "Not anymore." They reached room 13, and Morrison transferred the girl to the hospital bed with practiced efficiency. She arranged herself on the mattress like a porcelain doll, hands folded across her chest, staring upward at nothing. "Visiting hours?" Coleman asked.
Morrison was already walking toward the exit. "She doesn't get visitors, never has, but she likes it when people read to her. The other patients at Riverside used to read to her before..."
"Before what?"
Morrison paused at the doorway. "Before they stopped being able to read, or speak,
"Or think." When Coleman looked up from his paperwork, Morrison was gone. The old ambulance was nowhere to be seen, but patient 1349 was very much there, lying perfectly still in room 13, staring at the ceiling with eyes that had seen too much. The first incident happened 3 days later. Coleman arrived for his morning rounds to find that every book in the hospital library had been moved to patient 1349's room, not scattered or thrown, carefully stacked in neat piles around her bed as if she'd been reading them all night. But patient 1349 hadn't moved. The night shift nurse swore the girl had remained in the exact same position for the entire 12-hour shift. The books were arranged chronologically, from children's picture books near her pillow to advanced medical texts at the foot of her bed, and every single book had been read. Coleman could tell because the pages were turned, the spines were creased, and there were finger smudges on the paper. Small finger smudges, as if made by 7-year-old hands. "How did she move all these books?" Coleman asked the night nurse. "She didn't," Nurse Patterson insisted. "I checked on her every hour. She never moved, never spoke, never even blinked. But every time I looked in, there were more books in her room." Coleman reviewed the security footage. For 12 hours, the cameras showed patient 1349 lying motionless in her bed while books appeared around her one by one, as if materializing from thin air. At 3:17 a.m., the footage showed something that made Coleman's hands shake. Patient 1349's lips moving as if she was reading aloud, but her eyes never left the ceiling and her body never moved. The audio feed picked up her voice, the whispered recitation of medical textbooks, psychology journals, and psychiatric case studies. But she was reading them all simultaneously, multiple books at once, her child's voice layering into a chorus of whispered knowledge. That night, 3 patients in adjacent rooms reported the same dream, a 7-year-old girl reading to them from books they couldn't understand, books filled with secrets about the human mind that weren't meant to be known. They woke up with information they shouldn't have possessed, detailed knowledge of psychiatric medications, surgical procedures, and treatment protocols that none of them had ever been exposed to. By the end of the week, every patient in Pine Valley was speaking in medical terminology they shouldn't have known. They discussed their own conditions with the expertise of trained psychiatrists. They analyzed each other's symptoms with frightening accuracy, and they all spoke in the same whispered voice Coleman had heard on the security footage. Coleman realized what was happening. Patient 1349 wasn't just reading the books. She was absorbing them, processing them, and somehow sharing that knowledge with every other patient in the facility. 71 years of imposed learning, a force-fed education in the darkest corners of psychiatric medicine, and now she was teaching others. But teaching them what? Coleman found his answer in patient 1349's room on his final night at Pine Valley. The girl was sitting up for the first time since her arrival, surrounded by towers of books that reached the ceiling. Medical journals, case studies, treatment protocols, but also blueprints of the facility, staff schedules, security protocols, and detailed psychological profiles of every employee. When she finally looked at him with those ancient eyes in that 7-year-old face, Coleman understood that she hadn't been the patient all along. She'd been the student. And now, after 71 years of lessons, she was ready to graduate. "Thank you, Dr. Coleman," she said in a voice that held 7 decades of accumulated wisdom and pain. "I've learned everything I need to know about how to run a psychiatric facility." Coleman tried to run, but found that his body no longer obeyed his commands. Around him, he could hear the other patients moving through the halls with purpose, speaking in unified voices about treatment protocols and patient management. The last thing Coleman saw before his mind joined theirs was patient 1349 standing beside his bed, holding a clipboard with transfer forms that had his name at the top.
Pine Valley Mental Health Facility is still operating. The state inspector who visited last month reported that it was the most efficiently run psychiatric hospital he'd ever seen. Every patient was calm, cooperative, and remarkably well educated about their treatment. The staff all spoke with the same quiet authority, and they seemed to know exactly what each patient needed before they even asked. The inspector noted in his report that the facility's director appeared unusually young for her position. She looked no older than 7, but her expertise in psychiatric medicine was absolutely remarkable. Patient 1349 had finally found her calling.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now, before the next nightmare finds you.